The night Nelson Hawkins pulled a fist-sized nugget of gold from the black throat of the Widow's Reach mine, the mountain itself seemed to groan in protest, as though the earth had been holding its breath for 20 years and had finally been forced to release it in a shudder that ran clean through his boots. It was the spring of 1878, and the San Juan Mountains of the Colorado Territory still wore their winter snow in long white ribbons along the highest ridges, even as the valleys below had gone green and muddy with melt. Nelson had ridden into the town of Placer Creek 3 weeks earlier with little more than a played-out mare, a second-hand Henry rifle, and the particular kind of hunger that comes from a man who has lost everything once already and cannot bear to lose it twice. His family's cattle ranch outside Abilene had dried up and blown away in the drought of 1874. The bank had taken the land in 1876, and his father had died of a broken heart not long after, leaving Nelson with nothing but a name, a horse, and a stubborn belief that somewhere out west a man could still remake his fortune with his own 2 hands. He had heard about Widow's Reach the way most men in Placer Creek eventually heard about it, in the low voices of miners at the Silver Dollar Saloon, voices that dropped even lower whenever a stranger asked too many questions. The claim sat on the northern shoulder of a peak the locals called Mount Sentinel, and it had a reputation that no assay office could measure. 3 men had died working that shaft in the last 19 years, and every one of Placer Creek's old-timers agreed on one point, even when they agreed on nothing else. The mountain did not want to be dug into, and it made its displeasure known. You go up there alone," Old Man Higgins had told him over a warm beer, his knuckles swollen and his eyes clouded with cataracts but sharp as flint all the same. "Ain't nobody in this town going to partner with you on that ground, not since the Wallace boy." The Wallace boy, Nelson had asked. Thomas Wallace. Good boy, hard worker, sister still runs the trading post down on Main Street. He struck color up there 2 years back, same as everybody who ever struck color up there. And inside of a week he was dead under 12 tons of rock that came down without so much as a rumble of warning. No blasting powder gone off, no rain to loosen it, nothing. It just came down, like the mountain decided it was done with him. Nelson had turned that story over in his mind more times than he cared to admit, but a story was not a fact, and a curse was not a law of nature, and he had ridden too far and lost too much to be turned back by campfire talk. Gold was gold. It did not care about legends. That was what he told himself, at least. On the morning he shouldered his pack, checked the load in his rifle, and started up the game trail that wound toward the abandoned mouth of Widow's Reach. He met Celia Wallace for the first time 2 days before that climb, and if he had known then how much that meeting would come to matter, he might have looked at her longer than the few seconds his manners allowed. The trading post on Main Street was a low building of rough-cut pine with a tin roof that had gone the color of a storm cloud, and it smelled of coffee beans, tallow candles, and the particular dust that seemed to coat everything in a mining town, no matter how often it was swept. Celia stood behind the counter, measuring out flour into a burlap sack when Nelson pushed through the door, and the bell above the frame gave a small, tired clang. She was perhaps 24 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, and there was a wariness in the set of her shoulders that Nelson recognized because he wore the same wariness himself, the kind that came from being disappointed by the world often enough to stop expecting anything else from it. "Help you find something?" she asked, not looking up from the scale. "Looking for a pick and a shovel, ma'am, and maybe some rope if you've got it. Heard you keep the best stocked shelves in town." "I keep the only stocked shelves in town," she said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was not far from one either. "Depends what you mean to do with the pick and shovel. If you're another one of Drummond's men come to survey somebody else's claim out from under them, I'll thank you to take your business to his own company store." "No, ma'am, I'm not working for anybody. Name's Nelson Hawkins. I'm looking to stake my own ground." Something in her face shifted then, closed like a door easing shut. "There's plenty of unclaimed ground east of the creek, Mr. Hawkins. Good luck to you there. I heard there was a claim up on Mount Sentinel gone abandoned. Widow's Reach." The flour scoop stopped moving in her hand. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Nelson had the distinct impression he had said something he could not unsay. "That claim belonged to my brother," she said finally, her voice even but tight, like a rope pulled taut. "He is dead now, Mr. Hawkins, on account of that mountain, and I would not wish that ground on a man I had never even met, let alone one standing in my store looking for rope to hang himself with, if you will pardon the crudeness." "I'm sorry for your loss," Nelson said, and he meant it plainly, without the practiced smoothness men sometimes use for condolences they do not feel. "I didn't know." "No, you wouldn't." She set the scoop down and finally looked at him directly, and Nelson found himself struck by the color of her eyes, a gray-green like sage after rain. "Most men who go looking for that mine don't know, and the ones who do know go anyway. Gold does something to a man's better sense. I have watched it happen more times than I care to count." He bought his rope and his pick and his shovel, and he left without arguing further, because there did not seem to be anything useful to argue, and because some instinct told him that a woman who had buried a brother on that mountain deserved better than a stranger's insistence that he knew his own business best. But he did not change his plans. That night in the small room he rented above the livery, he lay awake listening to the wind come down off the peaks and thought about her eyes, and about her brother, and about the 12 tons of rock that had come down without so much as a rumble of warning. He climbed anyway. 2 days later, with the sun barely cresting the eastern ridgeline and throwing long blue shadows across the snow, Nelson Hawkins started up the trail toward Widow's Reach, and he did not look back at the town below, because if he had, he might have seen Celia Wallace standing on the porch of her trading post, watching him go with an expression she would not have wanted him to see. The mine entrance was little more than a black wound in the mountainside, framed by weathered timbers gray with age, and hung with a few rotted strands of what had once been a warning rope. Someone, at some point, had painted a crude cross on one of the support beams, whether as a marker of the dead or a plea for protection Nelson could not say. He stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling the cold breath of the shaft against his face, air that smelled of wet stone and something else beneath it, something mineral and old that he could not name. "Superstition," he said aloud, to no one, and the word came out smaller than he intended, swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the mountain around him. He worked through the short afternoon light with the methodical patience of a man who has learned that impatience costs more than it saves. He cleared debris from the collapsed section near the entrance, shored up a leaning timber with a fresh one he had carried up strapped to his back, and pushed deeper into the tunnel than, by old man Higgins's account, anyone had gone since Thomas Wallace's death. The walls narrowed and then widened again into a small chamber, and it was there in the lantern light that Nelson saw the vein. It ran through the rock like a river caught mid-flow. A bright seam of quartz shot through with gold so rich it seemed almost to move in the flickering light. His hands shook as he chipped away at the edge of it, and when the first fist-sized nugget dropped free into his palm, heavier than any stone had a right to be, he felt something in his chest crack open, half joy and half disbelief. "My God," he whispered. "My God, I've done it." It was in that same moment, with the nugget still warm from his own grip, that the mountain answered him. The sound began low, almost beneath hearing, a vibration more felt than heard, traveling up through the soles of his boots and into his bones. The lantern flame bent sideways as though caught in a draft, though there was no wind that deep in the earth. Somewhere behind him, in the tunnel he had come through, he heard what might have been voices, low and rhythmic, chanting in a language he did not know, rising and falling like something sung at a funeral. He told himself it was the wind finding some crack in the rock, some natural chimney that carried sound in strange ways. But the hair on his arms rose all the same, and the nugget in his hand felt suddenly less like a blessing and more like a weight he had been handed without understanding what it cost. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking against the stone. No one answered. The chanting, if it had been chanting at all, faded into the ordinary silence of dripping water and settling rock. He should have left then. Later, lying in Celia Wallace's spare room with his ankle wrapped and his head throbbing, he would think back on that moment and know, with the clarity that only comes after disaster, that he should have turned around and walked back down the mountain with his nugget and his good fortune and never looked back. But the promise of more gold, of the vein running deeper into the chamber, pulled at him with a force stronger than caution, and he dug on for another hour, filling his sample bag with ore, until the light outside had gone from gold to gray to the deep blue of early evening. It was on his way out, exhausted and triumphant, and already imagining the look on the assay office clerk's face, that the mountain took its due. The rockslide came without the rumble of warning that old man Higgins had described, exactly as he had described it, and Nelson would remember that detail for the rest of his life. One moment he was walking through the narrow passage near the entrance, lantern swinging in his hand, and the next the ceiling above him simply let go, a section of rock and shattered timber crashing down with a violence that threw him sideways into the tunnel wall. He felt his ankle twist beneath him, heard the sickening crack of it even over the roar of falling stone, and then something struck the side of his head and the world went white and then dark. He did not know how long he lay there. When he came back to himself, the lantern had gone out, and he was in a blackness so complete it pressed against his eyes like a physical thing. Blood ran warm down the side of his face. His ankle screamed when he tried to move it. For a moment, pinned in the dark beneath a mountain that had just tried to bury him, Nelson Hawkins believed, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that old man Higgins had been right, and that the curse of Widow's Reach was not superstition at all, but a debt collector, and he had just run up a bill he could not pay. It took him nearly 2 hours to drag himself free of the tunnel, favoring his ruined ankle, feeling his way along the walls in the dark, the sample bag of gold ore still clutched against his chest, because some stubborn part of him refused to let go of it even as he bled. When he finally emerged into the open air, the stars were out in their thousands, and the cold night wind felt like the sweetest thing he had ever known. He did not remember the walk down the mountain, not really, only fragments of it, the pain in his ankle, the taste of blood in his mouth, the way the lights of Placer Creek seemed impossibly far away and then, at last, impossibly close. He remembered stumbling past the edge of town, past dark windows and sleeping dogs, and he remembered, with the particular clarity that comes at the edge of consciousness, seeing a lamp still burning in the window of the trading post, and thinking that it was the only light left awake in the whole world, and that he had to reach it. He collapsed against the porch steps just as the door opened. Celia Wallace would tell him later that she had not been able to sleep that night, had lain awake with a strange unease she could not name, and had gotten up to check the lock on the front door when she heard something heavy fall against the wood of her porch. She would tell him that when she opened the door and saw him there, bloodied and pale in the lamplight, her first thought had not been fear but a terrible, familiar grief, because for one long moment she had believed the mountain had sent her brother's ghost home to die on her doorstep a second time. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, kneeling beside him, her voice shaking despite the steadiness she forced into it. "Mr. Hawkins, can you hear me?" "Miss Wallace," he managed, through a throat gone dry as dust. "I believe I owe you an apology. You are bleeding on my porch," she said. "Apologize later. Can you stand if I help you?" Between the two of them, with Nelson leaning heavily on her shoulder and biting back sounds of pain he did not want her to hear, they made it inside. She settled him on a narrow cot in the small room behind the store that had once belonged to her brother, and she worked over him with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a woman who had learned to tend wounds because there was no one else to do it. She cleaned the gash on his head with carbolic soap and warm water, wrapped his ankle tight with strips of clean cloth, and only when the immediate work was done did she sit back on her heels and look at him properly, taking in the dried blood on his shirt and the sample bag he had refused even now to let out of his reach. "You went up to Widow's Reach," she said. "It was not a question." "I did. And you found gold." He hesitated, then reached into the bag with his good hand and drew out the nugget, setting it on the small table beside the cot where the lamplight caught its dull, heavy shine. Celia stared at it for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that was not greed, not exactly, but something closer to old sorrow reawakened. "That is the richest sample I have ever seen come off that mountain," she said quietly. "My brother found color too, you know, not so much as this, but enough to believe in it, enough to die for it." "I'm sorry," Nelson said again, and this time the words felt heavier in his mouth. "I heard the story before I went up. I went anyway. Most men do." She stood, moving to bank the fire in the small stove against the corner, and for a while neither of them spoke, the only sound the crackle of new wood catching flame and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere out on the flats. Then, without turning around, she said, "Tell me what happened up there, all of it. Do not spare me the parts that sound foolish." So he told her. He told her about the vein of gold running through the rock like a river, about the nugget's strange weight in his palm, about the chanting he had heard or thought he heard, low and rhythmic in a language he did not know, and about the rockslide that had come without any rumble of warning, exactly as old man Higgins had described the deaths before his. When he finished, Celia had gone very still, her back to him, her hands pressed flat against the stove's warm surface as though she needed something solid to hold on to. "That is exactly how my brother described the days before he died," she said. "The sounds in the tunnel. He wrote about it in his journal before. I thought it was only his nerves, working too many hours alone in the dark. Now I do not know what to think. You have his journal, somewhere. I never had the heart to read all of it. It felt like reading his last words before I was ready to." She turned to face him then, and her expression had hardened into something resolute. "You should sell that claim, Mr. Hawkins. Whatever you found up there, it is not worth what it will cost you. I have already buried one man who thought he could outsmart that mountain. I do not care to attend a second funeral on the same account, even for a stranger who arrived in my town only 3 weeks ago." "I hear you," Nelson said, and he did hear her, in the way a man hears a warning bell even as he keeps walking toward the fire. "But I have got nothing left to go back to, Miss Wallace. No ranch, no family, no money beyond what's in my saddlebags. That gold up there is the first piece of good luck I have had in 4 years. I am not in a hurry to walk away from it just because the mountain groans at night." She studied him for a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to soften something in her own, though she would not have admitted it aloud. "Then you had better let me look at that ankle again in the morning," she said, "because if you mean to be a fool, you will at least be a fool who can walk." He stayed in that small back room for the better part of a week, unable to put weight on the ankle, and in that week something began to grow between Nelson Hawkins and Celia Wallace that neither of them had gone looking for, and neither of them, if they were honest, quite knew how to stop. She brought him coffee in the mornings and changed his bandages without being asked, and in the long afternoons, when the store was quiet and the light came in low and gold through the front window, they talked. He told her about Texas, about the ranch his father had built with his own 2 hands and lost to a drought that seemed determined to finish what the war and the railroads had started. He told her about his mother, who had died of fever when he was 12, and about the particular loneliness of watching a family's fortune disappear a little at a time until there was nothing left to disappear. She told him about her father, Amos Wallace, who had come west in the gold rush of 1859 with nothing but a mule and a Bible, and had somehow, against every likelihood, built a life that lasted. She told him about her brother Thomas, 3 years older than her, who had inherited their father's stubbornness but not his caution, and who had gone up to Widow's Reach against every warning their father had left him, because he believed, as young men often do, that he was the exception to every rule that had claimed other men before him. My father knew the Ute people who wintered in this valley before the mines came, she told him one evening, sitting in the chair beside his cot with a mending basket in her lap, though her hands had gone still on the fabric. He traded fair with them, learned some of their language, respected their ways even when other men in this territory did not. He used to say the San Juans were not empty land waiting for white men to find their fortune in it. He said they were somebody's home long before any of us arrived, and that a man ought to remember that even after the government signed its papers and called the land his. The Brunot Agreement, Nelson said. He had heard of it vaguely, in the way a man hears of laws that were made in rooms far away and signed by men he would never meet. The one that opened up the San Juans for mining. The Ute did not give up this land because they wanted to, Celia said, and there was an edge in her voice now, quiet but sharp. They gave it up because the government made it clear what would happen if they did not. My father called it a theft dressed up in the clothes of a treaty, and he was not wrong to call it that. Widow's Reach sits on ground that was a burial place once before the mining claims came through. There is an old man, still living up in the hills west of here, a Ute elder they call Standing Elk. My father used to visit him. He told my father, years ago, that a curse had been laid on that mountain by one of his own people after the first miners disturbed the graves there in the rush of '59. My father believed it was only a story meant to frighten trespassers away. Then Thomas died exactly as the story said men would die, and I have not been able to decide what I believe since. Nelson turned that over in his mind long after Celia had gone to bed that night, lying awake with his bandaged ankle propped on a folded blanket, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. A curse laid by a grieving people on land that had been taken from them by force and paperwork alike. A young man dead under a rockslide that came without warning. A company town full of men too frightened to work a claim rich enough to make any of them wealthy. It did not sit easily in his chest, the way it might have 3 weeks earlier, when gold had seemed like the simplest thing in the world, a reward for hard work and nothing more. The trouble started in earnest the day Nelson was well enough to walk with a cane, when a man named Silas Drummond came into the trading post wearing a black coat too fine for the dust of Placer Creek and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Drummond owned, by that point, nearly every profitable claim within 10 miles of town, along with the company store that undercut Celia's prices whenever it suited him, and the mortgage papers on more than one struggling miner's cabin. He was a heavy man going soft at the middle, with small pale eyes and the kind of careful, unhurried way of speaking that Nelson recognized from bank managers back in Texas, men who had learned to make threats sound like favors. "Mr. Hawkins," Drummond said, extending a hand Nelson did not particularly want to shake. "Word travels fast in a town this size. I hear you have taken quite an interest in Widow's Reach." "News does travel fast," Nelson said, keeping his own hand at his side a beat longer than politeness allowed before finally taking Drummond's. "Can't say I've announced it to many folks." "You do not need to announce a rockslide, Mr. Hawkins." Half the town heard the mountain groan that night, and the other half saw you come stumbling down bloody as a butchered hog. Drummond's smile widened, though it still did not touch his eyes. "I would like to make you an offer for that claim, a generous one given its history. Say $300 cash money today, and you can be on the next stage out of this territory with your health intact." "That's a strange offer for a mine you don't own," Nelson said. "Especially generous for a claim you keep telling folks is cursed. I am a practical man, Mr. Hawkins, not a superstitious one. But I am also a man who has buried enough of his own workers in this territory to know that some ground is not worth the trouble of digging, whatever glitters in it. I would hate to see a newcomer to Placer Creek meet the same fate as poor Thomas Wallace, especially when I am in a position to spare him the trouble. Celia, who had been standing behind the counter through the entire exchange with her jaw tight enough to ache, spoke before Nelson could answer. You did not seem so concerned for my brother's welfare when you were trying to buy this claim off him for less than what you are offering Mr. Hawkins now, Mr. Drummond. If I recall, your final offer to Thomas was $100, and you called him a fool to his face for turning it down. Drummond's smile flickered just slightly before settling back into place. Miss Wallace, grief has a way of coloring a person's memory. I offered your brother what the claim was worth at the time. Mr. Hawkins here has proven the ground worth more, so naturally my offer reflects that. There is nothing sinister in simple arithmetic. There is something sinister in a man who tells strangers a mine is cursed while offering to buy it, Nelson said, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that his voice had gone hard in a way it had not been in a long while. If you thought it was really cursed, Mr. Drummond, I don't imagine you would want it at any price. For a moment something flashed behind Drummond's pale eyes, gone almost before Nelson could name it, but it left a chill in the room all the same. A wise man takes precautions against things he does not fully understand, Mr. Hawkins. I would advise you to do the same. $300. The offer stands until sundown Friday. He left without waiting for an answer, the bell over the door clanging behind him with a violence that seemed to linger in the sudden silence of the store. I don't trust that man, Celia said, once the sound of Drummond's boots had faded from the boardwalk outside. Neither do I, Nelson said, and I trust him a good deal less now than I did 5 minutes ago. That night, after the store had closed and Celia had banked the fire, she brought out a battered leather journal from a trunk beneath her bed and set it on the table between them, her hands lingering on the cover as though she were not entirely certain she wanted to open it after all. I have not read past the first few pages, she admitted. I could not bring myself to. But if we are going to understand what happened to my brother, I think we had better start here. They read it together by lamplight, Celia's shoulder close against Nelson's as they leaned over the pages. And the story that unfolded was not the story of a cursed man losing his mind to fear, but the story of a frightened young man who had begun, in his final weeks, to suspect something far more earthly than any curse. Thomas Wallace had written of finding gold in the same chamber Nelson had found it, of the strange sounds in the tunnel that he attributed at first to settling rock and echoing wind. But later entries grew more specific, more troubled. He wrote of finding blasting caps in a side passage that he had not placed there himself, caps of a manufacture different from his own supply. He wrote of a visit from Silas Drummond, who had come to his claim not once but 3 times in the weeks before his death, each visit ending with a thinly veiled threat dressed up as neighborly concern. And in the final entry, dated only 2 days before the rockslide that killed him, Thomas had written words that made Celia's breath catch audibly in the quiet room. Drummond came again today, told me plain that men who dig too deep sometimes find more than gold, and that the mountain has a way of settling its own debts. I do not think he means the curse, whatever he pretends. I think he means something closer to home. I have found a second seam, richer than the first, deeper into the chamber than any prospector before me has gone. I mean to file the amended claim in town tomorrow, before Drummond can make good on whatever he intends. If anything should happen to me before I can do so, I want it known that I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in men who profit from other men's fear. Neither Nelson nor Celia spoke for a long while after that. The lamp flickered low, throwing long shadows across the journal's worn pages, and outside the wind picked up against the shutters with a sound that, for the first time since he had come down off that mountain, did not seem quite so much like the mountain groaning as it did like the ordinary, restless weather of a Colorado spring. He never got to file that claim, Celia said finally, her voice thin with a grief made sharper by anger. Because he died the next morning and the claim fell back to unclaimed ground, and everyone in this town, myself included, told ourselves it was the curse that took him, because a curse is a thing you cannot fight, and a murderer is a thing you are supposed to be able to bring to justice, and I did not know how to do that without proof, and I did not know how to look for proof without falling apart. You have proof now, Nelson said quietly, or the start of it. A journal is not proof a court will accept. It is a dead man's suspicions. She closed the book gently, as though it were something fragile, and pressed both hands flat against its cover. But it is more than I had yesterday. And I do not intend to let Silas Drummond make a widow of some other woman's brother, or a fool's grave of some other family's hope, if there is anything at all I can do to stop him. Then we do something about it together, Nelson said, and when Celia looked up at him, startled by the plainness of the offer, he found himself meaning it more completely than he had meant almost anything in the 4 hard years since his father's ranch had blown away in the dust. I did not come to Placer Creek looking to fall into the middle of somebody else's grief, Miss Wallace. But I am in the middle of it now, and I would rather stand here and help you finish what your brother started than run from a mountain that has already tried to kill me once and failed. Something passed between them in that lamplit silence, something neither of them named aloud, but that settled into the room as surely as the fire's warmth. Celia reached out, almost without meaning to, and laid her hand briefly over his where it rested on the table beside the closed journal. "Thank you," she said simply, and it was enough. In the days that followed, as Nelson's ankle healed enough to bear his weight without the cane, they built their case piece by piece, the way a man builds a house he means to live in for the rest of his life, laying one careful board atop another. Nelson climbed back up to Widow's Reach, this time with Celia insisting on coming along despite his protests, and together they found the side passage Thomas had written of, and the blasting caps still lodged in the rubble where the rockslide had come down, caps stamped with a manufacturer's mark that matched, when they checked it against records at the assay office. A supply shipment received not by any independent miner, but by the Drummond Mining Company itself, 3 weeks before Thomas Wallace's death. They found, too, in a hollow behind a loose stone in the deepest chamber, a small collection of items that made Celia go very quiet and very still. A strand of beadwork gone brittle with age, a fragment of bone too old and too carefully placed to belong to any accident, the remains, unmistakably, of a burial disturbed long ago and never properly returned to rest. "This is what Standing Elk spoke of," Celia said softly, kneeling beside the hollow with the careful reverence of a woman standing in a church. "This is the grave the curse remembers." Nelson removed his hat without quite knowing why he did it, some instinct older than reason telling him it was the only decent thing a man could do standing in a place like that. "We ought to bring him here, the elder, if he is still willing to speak with strangers about it." "He spoke with my father," Celia said. "Perhaps he will speak with my father's daughter if I ask it plainly and mean it." They rode out together 2 days later, following a trail Celia remembered from childhood visits with her father, up into the foothills west of Placer Creek, where a small band of Ute families still wintered in the shelter of the pines, having refused, in the quiet, stubborn way of people who have already lost too much, to be moved entirely from the mountains their ancestors had always known. Standing Elk received them without surprise, as though he had been expecting some version of this visit for a long time, and he listened to Celia's halting explanation, and to Nelson's account of the strange sounds and the rockslide that came without warning, with a patience that made Nelson feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely small before another man's grief. "My people did not curse that mountain out of cruelty," Standing Elk said at last, his English careful and unhurried, learned over decades of trading with men who had never bothered to learn his own language in return. "We cursed it out of sorrow and out of warning, the way a father warns a child away from a fire that has already burned him once. The graves your people dug into were not marked with stone or fence, because we do not mark our dead the way you do, but they were sacred all the same, and when the diggers came in the rush of '59 and scattered bones like refuse in their search for gold, my grandfather, who was a holy man among us, spoke a warning over that mountain, that it would not give its wealth freely to any man who took without giving something back in return. What would it take, Nelson asked, for that debt to be settled? Standing Elk studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes taking Nelson's measure in a way that felt more thorough than any bank examiner's ledger. Respect, he said finally. Return what was taken. Do not simply dig and leave. Ask before you take. And remember always that the wealth in that ground was never truly unclaimed, no matter what papers your government signed to say otherwise. It was Celia who spoke next, her voice steady despite the tremor Nelson could see in her hands. My father always said the same, though he put it in simpler words. He said a man who takes without giving back builds his house on a foundation that will not hold. I do not know if I believe in curses the way the old stories tell them, Standing Elk, but I believe in that. I have watched greed hollow this town out from the inside for 2 years, and I do not intend to let it hollow out anything more, not if there is a way to build something better instead. Standing Elk's expression softened just slightly at that. Bring the bones to me properly, with the respect they were denied, and I will see them return to rest. As for the mine and the gold in it, that is a matter for your own conscience, not mine. But know that a mountain remembers longer than a man does, and there is a difference between wealth taken with gratitude and wealth taken with greed. The mountain has always known which is which, even when the men digging into it could not tell the two apart. They rode back to Placer Creek in a silence that felt less like the absence of words and more like the presence of something too large to speak of easily, and it was on that ride, with the sun going down gold and red behind the western peaks, and the horses moving at an easy walk along the familiar trail, that Nelson reached over and took Celia's hand where it rested on her saddle horn, and she did not pull it away. I did not come out here looking for you, he said quietly. I came out here looking for gold, same as every other fool who ever climbed that mountain. But I think I have found something worth a good deal more than what is sitting in my sample bags, Celia Wallace, and I would be a bigger fool than any of them if I let it ride on past without saying so. She looked over at him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed less like sage after rain and more like something warmer, something that had thawed slowly over the past weeks without either of them quite noticing until now. You are a strange man, Nelson Hawkins, she said. You ride into my town with nothing, nearly die on a cursed mountain within a month of arriving, and somehow, in the middle of chasing down a murderer and returning stolen bones to their rightful rest, you find the nerve to court me. Seems as good a time as any, he said, and something in his tone, half earnest and half rueful, drew a laugh out of her that he had not heard before, low and real and entirely unguarded. It is a terrible time, she said. It is possibly the worst time in the history of courting, and yet, she did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. Her hand tightened around his, and they rode the rest of the way back to town like that, hand in hand across the space between their two horses, saying nothing more because nothing more needed saying just yet. The confrontation with Celia's Drummond, when it came faster and more violently than either of them had prepared for. Word had reached Drummond, through whatever network of paid ears he kept scattered around Placer Creek, that Nelson had been asking questions at the assay office about blasting cap shipments, and that Celia Wallace had ridden out to visit the Ute encampment in the hills, and Drummond was not a man who waited patiently to see what such rumors might grow into. 3 nights after their ride back from Standing Elk's camp, as Nelson sat going over the journal one final time by lamplight in the back room of the trading post, the front window of the store shattered inward with a violence that brought both him and Celia to their feet, hearts pounding, before either of them had fully understood what had happened. A burning rag, soaked in coal oil and wrapped around a stone, had been thrown through the glass, and it landed smoking against a shelf of dry goods that would have gone up in flames within minutes if Nelson had not been close enough to smother it under a wet blanket before the fire could truly catch. "Drummond," Celia said, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear as she stared at the broken glass glittering on her floor. "That coward! He would burn down my father's store rather than let the truth come out." "He is running scared," Nelson said, checking the street outside through the shattered window, though whoever had thrown the rag was long gone into the dark. "A man does not throw fire through a window unless he believes the walls are already closing in around him." They rode to the marshal's office that same night, journal and blasting caps in hand, and Marshal Ezra Colton, a lean, weathered man who had worn a badge in 3 territories before settling in Placer Creek, listened to their account with the grim, unhurried attention of a man who had suspected something of the sort for longer than he cared to admit. "I have had my own doubts about Drummond for the better part of a year," Colton admitted, turning the journal's pages carefully by lamplight. 2 dead prospectors before Thomas Wallace, both on claims Drummond wanted, both deaths ruled accidental on evidence that seemed thin even at the time. "I never had proof enough to move against a man with his kind of money and his kind of lawyers. This might be enough, if the blasting cap shipment records hold up in a proper hearing. There is also the matter of tonight," Nelson said, gesturing toward the singed edge of the blanket he had used to smother the fire, which he had brought along as evidence of its own kind. "A man does not throw fire through an innocent woman's window unless he has something considerably worse than mere business dealings to hide." Colton nodded slowly. "I will need more than suspicion to arrest a man of Drummond's standing, Mr. Hawkins, but I believe I know how to get it. Drummond is a proud man, and proud men make careless mistakes when they believe themselves cornered. If we can draw him into showing his hand plainly, in front of witnesses who cannot be bought or intimidated into silence, we will have what we need." The plan they settled on, hashed out over the following 2 days in careful whispers between Nelson, Celia, and the marshal, was simple in its design if considerably more dangerous in its execution. Nelson would return to Widow's Reach openly, making a show of preparing to file an amended claim on the second, richer seam that Thomas Wallace had discovered, but never lived to register, ensuring that word of his intentions reached Drummond through the same network of paid ears that had carried word of their earlier investigations. If Drummond believed his crime was about to be exposed through the filing of that claim, and believed as well that Nelson intended to file it that very evening before Drummond could intervene, there was a strong likelihood he would move to stop it himself, directly, rather than trust the matter to intermediaries who might later be persuaded to testify against him. It played out almost exactly as they had hoped, though with a tension that left Nelson's palms sweating despite the cold night air as he waited near the mine entrance in the fading light. Marshal Colton and 2 deputized men concealed among the rocks above the trail, Celia waiting. Against every instinct, Nelson had to keep her far from danger, close enough to serve as a second witness should Drummond arrive with company of his own. Drummond came just after dark, exactly as predicted, with 2 hired men at his back and a pistol visible at his hip that he had not troubled to conceal. "Mr. Hawkins," Drummond called out, his careful, unhurried voice stripped now of its earlier pretense of friendliness. "I understand you mean to file an amended claim tonight. I would advise against it." "Would you?" Nelson said, stepping out from the mine entrance where the lantern light caught him plainly. "And why is that, Mr. Drummond? Worried the mountain might take offense?" "I am worried you do not understand the kind of trouble you are stirring up, digging where other men have already died trying." Drummond's hand rested near his pistol now, though he had not yet drawn it. "I offered you a fair price for that ground, Mr. Hawkins. My patience for fair offers has a limit." "Your patience ran out with Thomas Wallace too, didn't it?" Nelson said, keeping his voice steady though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You had him killed when he found this same seam and refused to sell. Set the blasting caps yourself, or had one of your men do it, and let the whole town believe a curse had taken him so nobody would look at you twice. Drummond's expression did not change, but something in his stillness confirmed the accusation more plainly than any words could have. "That is a serious charge, Mr. Hawkins, and a foolish one, to make to a man's face with only his own hired hands as witness. He is not the only witness, Mr. Drummond." Marshal Colton's voice rang out from the rocks above, and Drummond's men spun toward the sound, hands moving toward their own weapons before Colton's deputies rose into view with rifles already leveled, making clear the poor wisdom of drawing further. "I have had this claim watched for 2 days now, ever since Mr. Hawkins and Miss Wallace brought me evidence linking blasting caps found at the site of Thomas Wallace's death to a shipment received by your company. I would suggest you and your men lower your hands slowly, Drummond, unless you would like to add a charge of resisting arrest to whatever else this evening turns up." For a long, taut moment, it seemed as though Drummond might gamble on violence rather than surrender, his pale eyes flicking between Nelson, the marshal's men above, and the dark mouth of the mine itself, as though calculating whether the mountain might yet provide him one final, convenient accident. But whatever calculation he made, it did not favor a gunfight against men already positioned with the advantage, and slowly, with visible fury but no further resistance, he raised his hands, and his men followed suit. "This is not finished, Hawkins," Drummond said, as Colton's deputies moved to secure his wrists. "A journal and some blasting caps prove nothing in a court of law." "Maybe not on their own," Nelson said. "But your foreman, the one who set those charges on your orders, might have a different account, once the marshal makes clear how much easier his own sentence goes if he tells the truth about who gave the order. Men like you always believe loyalty runs deeper than fear, Mr. Drummond. I have found in my experience that it rarely does." It took the better part of 2 months for the full truth to come out in the territorial court in Del Norte, but come out it did, piece by piece, exactly as Nelson had predicted. Drummond's foreman, faced with the prospect of hanging for a murder he had only carried out under orders, testified in exchange for a lesser charge, confirming that Drummond had directed him to set the collapse that killed Thomas Wallace, and had done the same, years earlier, to 2 other prospectors whose claims he had coveted. Silas Drummond was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang, and though it brought Celia no particular joy to see justice arrive in such a grim form, it brought her, at last, something she had not felt in 2 long years: the settling of a debt that had gone unpaid since her brother's death, and the quiet relief of knowing the town would no longer live under the shadow of a curse that had, in truth, been a man's greed wearing the mountain's grief as a disguise. With Drummond's estate seized and his fraudulent claims dissolved by the court, the mine at Widow's Reach passed clean and clear into Nelson's ownership, alongside the amended claim on the second seam that Thomas Wallace had discovered and never lived to file. Nelson insisted, and Celia agreed without hesitation, that the claim be registered under both their names, in honor of the brother whose careful, courageous investigation had made the whole truth possible, and it was Celia herself who suggested, with a fierceness that brooked no argument, that the mine be renamed. They rode out to the mountain one final time before the spring thaw gave way fully to summer, bringing with them the small collection of remains they had found in the deepest chamber, wrapped now with careful reverence in clean cloth rather than left forgotten behind a loose stone. Standing Elk met them at the mine entrance, along with several members of his community, and together they performed a quiet ceremony of return, laying the remains to rest properly in ground the elder himself selected, with words spoken in a language Nelson did not understand but felt, all the same, settle something long unsettled in his chest. "The debt is paid," Standing Elk said afterward, as the small gathering began to disperse back down the mountain trail. "Not because gold was found, but because it was returned to those who mourn it, and because the ones who profit from this ground now mean to remember what it cost. We mean to do more than remember, Celia said. My father always believed a man ought to leave a place better than he found it. Nelson and I intend to set aside a portion of every ounce this mine produces, for your people and for this town both, for schools and for fair dealing, so long as either of us has breath to see it done. Standing Elk studied her for a long moment, and something like approval, quiet and unhurried, passed across his weathered face. Your father was a good man, he said. It seems his daughter has not forgotten how to be one either. They renamed the mine that same day, striking the old name from the claim papers and writing in its place, at Celia's insistence, the Wallace Hawkins mine. And if the mountain groaned at all that evening as they rode back down toward Placer Creek in the long golden light, it was only, Nelson thought, the ordinary settling sound of rock and snow giving way to the coming of spring, nothing more sinister than that, and nothing that frightened him in the least. The wedding took place in June, on a warm evening when the whole of Placer Creek turned out to fill the small chapel at the edge of town and spill out onto the grass beyond its open doors, because no building in town was large enough to hold everyone who wanted to see Nelson Hawkins marry Celia Wallace. Old man Higgins gave away the bride, having appointed himself something like an honorary uncle to Celia in the months since her brother's death, and he cried without shame through the entire ceremony, dabbing at his clouded eyes with a handkerchief that had clearly seen better days. Marshal Colton stood as a witness, along with several of the miners who had once been too frightened to work anywhere near Widow's Reach, and who now, under Nelson and Celia's fair management, drew steady wages from a claim that had finally begun to give its wealth freely, exactly as Standing Elk had said it might, once the debt behind it had been properly settled. Standing Elk himself came down from the hills for the occasion, an honored guest whose presence a year earlier might have scandalized some of the more narrow-minded families in town, but who was greeted now, in the wake of everything that had happened, with a respect that Celia made certain to model plainly for anyone still inclined toward the old prejudices. He brought with him a gift for the couple, a small woven basket of a design Celia recognized from childhood visits to his camp with her father, and he pressed it into her hands with a rare, warm smile. For the home you will build together, he said. May it hold more good than sorrow, for longer than either of you can count. Celia wore her mother's ivory dress, taken in and let out in the places time and grief had changed her from the girl who had first tried it on years before, and Nelson wore a new suit purchased with the first honest profits of the mine, feeling in it more like the man his father had always hoped he would become than he had felt in the 4 hard years since the ranch blew away. When the preacher asked if he took Celia Wallace to be his wife, Nelson answered without a single moment's hesitation, his voice carrying clear and steady across the crowded little chapel. I do, and gladly, and I mean to spend every day I have left proving myself worthy of the answer. Celia's own vow when her turn came was simpler but no less certain. I have watched gold ruin men in this town, Nelson Hawkins, and I have watched grief nearly ruin me. You rode into Placer Creek chasing a fortune, and somewhere between a cursed mountain and a murderer's trial, you gave me back a reason to believe that good things could still happen here. I do. I have never meant anything so completely in my life. They settled into the trading post together after the wedding, expanding it within the year into a proper mercantile that served not only Placer Creek, but the growing string of mining camps spreading further into the San Juans, and Nelson split his time between the counter and the mine, learning, slowly and with Celia's patient guidance, the particular rhythm of a life built on partnership rather than solitary struggle. The Wallace Hawkins mine prospered steadily rather than explosively, exactly the kind of fortune that neither of them had to fear losing to the same greed that had claimed Thomas Wallace and nearly claimed Nelson himself, because they had built its foundation, as Standing Elk had advised, on respect rather than mere taking. Their first child arrived the following spring, a son they named Thomas, after the brother whose stubborn courage and careful journal had made everything that followed possible. And Nelson held the boy in the same small back room where Celia had once nursed his broken ankle and his bloodied head, feeling a happiness so complete it startled him with its simplicity. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Sage, for the particular gray-green color of her mother's eyes that Nelson had never quite stopped noticing, even after years of marriage had made every other detail of Celia's face as familiar to him as his own hands. Placer Creek grew up around them in the years that followed, shedding some of its rougher edges as families settled in alongside the prospectors. As a proper schoolhouse rose where Celia had once taught reading lessons out of her father's old Bible to any child whose parents could spare them from chores. As the fair-dealing Nelson and Celia insisted upon it, both the mine and the mercantile set a standard other business owners in town found themselves, slowly and sometimes grudgingly, obliged to match. Old man Higgins lived long enough to see both Wallace Hawkins' children grow past their toddling years, and he took a particular delight in teaching young Thomas the same card tricks and campfire stories that had once entertained a younger Nelson Hawkins in the Silver Dollar Saloon, before either of them had known what the mountain held in store for them. Standing Elk continued to visit Placer Creek on occasion, welcomed openly at the mercantile counter, and often invited to Sunday dinner at the Hawkins home, where he watched young Thomas and Sage grow with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had seen enough sorrow in his own life to recognize and to treasure the sight of a debt properly paid and a peace properly kept. The portion of the mine's profits that Nelson and Celia had promised on that first day of ceremony was never forgotten nor reduced, and over the years it funded not only improvements to Standing Elk's community but scholarships for children in Placer Creek regardless of their family's fortune, so that the wealth pulled from Widow's Reach, once feared as a curse, became instead something closer to what Amos Wallace had always believed the mountain's riches ought to be. A blessing shared rather than hoarded, a debt honored rather than denied. On quiet evenings, when the children had been put to bed and the store had been swept and locked for the night, Nelson and Celia sometimes sat together on the same porch where he had once collapsed bleeding into her arms, watching the last light fade gold and then violet over the peaks of Mount Sentinel. And it was on one such evening, some 7 years after that first terrible, wonderful night, that Celia rested her head against Nelson's shoulder and asked him, half in jest, whether he ever regretted riding up that mountain in the first place. Not for one single moment, he told her, and he meant it completely, the way he had come to mean everything in the years since the mountain had nearly taken his life, and instead, in some strange and roundabout fashion he still did not fully understand, had given him back a life worth living. I went up that mountain chasing gold, Celia Wallace Hawkins, and I came down with something worth 1,000 times more. I would climb it again tomorrow, broken ankle and all, if I knew it would lead me back to you a second time. That is a foolish thing to say, Celia said, though her voice was warm and her hand found his in the fading light exactly as it had on that ride back from Standing Elk's camp so many years before. You already have me. There is no need to risk your neck twice. No, Nelson agreed, drawing her closer against his side as the first stars began to appear over the ridgeline, steady and unhurried, exactly the way good fortune, once properly earned, tends to be. I suppose there is not. I have already found everything that mountain ever meant to give me. And in the years that followed, as Thomas and Sage grew tall and married and raised children of their own in a Placer Creek grown prosperous and fair under the careful stewardship their parents had built, no one in that town ever again spoke of Widow's Reach as a cursed place. They spoke of it instead as the mountain where Nelson Hawkins had struck it, rich the same night he learned what riches were truly worth, and where he had found, in the very same breath of wind that nearly buried him, the woman who would spend the rest of his long and grateful life beside him.